This is joint work with Chung Sup, who is here and who will handle the Slack side of things. And also, this is joint work with Coast John at NYU. So without further ado, let's begin. So we know the discussion on CSR is extremely rich. The Fortune 500 firms spend more than 15 billions. It's a huge part of corporate expenditure. And we've been debating for years and years on whether this is a reflection of good governance or whether this is a manifestation of agency problems within the firm. And many studies, many papers have been written on that. And in fact, our next facilitator as well, Farrell, Yang, and Limburg also has a angle on that too. Um, as you two very much thankfully introduced us, we would like to highlight another interesting and important aspect that has not really been the focus of the existing literature, and that is the information side of it. Namely, that CSR could alter a firm's information environment and affect the board's decision-making process thereby. So I think this is where I really would like to spend a lot of time on. The first question that we get asked a lot when we present this anywhere else is, do the stakeholders know about these sort of information? So here I would really like to highlight more than anything that CSR brings in both direct as well as indirect information benefits. It is true, as I will outline in a few slides time, that some stakeholders do happen to have such information regarding firm-specific information about the firm, really. But the indirect side of CSR cannot be ignored. And there has been a lot of evidence on how CSR disclosures can help analysts to better assess about the firm. And I think that's sort of like, I mean, as I just checked your point on Slack, and that's sort of going towards that direction. And also, Dimson, Elroy Dimson's paper with Olgujan and Kai Lee on the active ownership when shareholders intervene and do a sort of like ESG intervention. Generally, the firm's informational environment becomes more transparent thereafter. And this has been a hugely sort of like growing and a lot larger and lot more important segment of the money management market. There's the UNPRI designations and all these sort of like SRI funds coming in, and they make a portfolio choice based on these CSR sort of like, are the firms doing enough on the environmental or social end of things? So when we've got dedicated long-term investors like that, they're likely to bring in a lot of new sources of information production, be it from sell-side analysts that cater to them, or be it buy-side analysts, or a lot of them. And generally, it's not that, information or social side of the firm's activities, like building a park can by itself, sort of like reveal information from people using the park necessarily. But what we would like to emphasize is that there are direct and indirect benefits of building the park, one of which is we get access to a lot more of this sort of outside investors, analysts, and a lot more sources of like information generation. And that's likely to be useful for outside directors that depend on management for firm-specific information, because this has been known to be a source of tension between board and the CEO. CEO likes the board to be informed in its advising quantity, but he doesn't want to give away the incriminating monitoring information at the same time with them. So what we are saying is that that could also be materially be affected by the CSR side of it. So the next question, I think this is one of the points that D2 brought up, is if that's the case, would CSR be the most natural way of paying or generating this sort of information? And to this end, I would like to give a sort of like a slight analogy here more than anything. So if the firm, for example, think about this sort of situation, you know who the key senator that's going to be the pivotal for your sort of like a new project. If the firm knows exactly who holds the key information, there's no need for CSR. Sort of like you would be engaging in lobbying, you would go to him, you would look after his own interest or her own interest, and firm will want to target that directly. But what we are more interested in this paper and this type of situation is more like our junior professor sort of like tenure situation, if you like. You don't know who's going to be writing your letter. So what do you have to do? You have to be on the sort of like best behavior to everyone. And by doing that, you're catering to these sort of people's interest. So I am not building a park directly to get an information out of them, but it's going to be an important criteria that analysts and those sort of institutional investors will be taking into account of. And those people will be thinking about those sort of criteria in whether to come in or not. And once they come in, they will be generating that sort of information, materially affecting a firm's information environment. So that's the sort of like indirect end of the story that we're interested in. But there are indeed also examples of direct sort of like information revelation on the part of the stakeholders. And to that, I would like to bring you to the example of Nike. Now, Nike was known to be a very sort of like poor CSR, complete PR disaster in the 90s, known to be running slave shops in Bangladesh and all those places. So they tried to change the narrative by inviting an independent director, Jerker Conway, who institutionalized CSR drive at a board level. So this was a majority independent corporate responsibility subcommittee was set up within the board to address the Nike sort of like all these years of poor CSR sort of related issues. But there's a Harvard Business Review article written on this, and what the board found out was that through CSR, not only did it manage to improve its social side of performance, which was helpful, but the board was also able to gain in-depth knowledge of how the firm was producing and what can be done to better that. Really, they did an 18-month study really trying to improve labor conditions, but by doing that, as a byproduct, they were also able to identify root causes of what the excessive overtime issues that were causing as a drag on the cost side of things. And using that sort of knowledge, they were able to advise the firm's innovation efforts. Nike was very successful in buying an early Dutch startup that did eco-friendly fabric dyeing technology that used like 4 times pure amount of water than before. So this sort of evidence, be it direct, be it indirect, they all put together suggest the possibility that a firm's CSR drive could materially be related to its information environment. So Iju's questions regarding the points 2 and 3, that's I think how I would respond. So our main research question then is, could the stakeholder-induced information then be a valuable second opinion to the company's board? And if so, could it facilitate informed advising and monitoring by the board? So there's a theoretical side of our paper and there's the empirical side of our paper. Theoretically, what we do is we extend Adams and Ferreira's cheap talk game, and it's a very simple extension between the board and the CEO with monitoring and advising tension. So we model CSR as an endogenous option for the board, which can directly or indirectly reduce the degree of information asymmetry that the board faces relative to the CEO. So think about how, as the firm becomes more transparent, as more people are giving a lot more sources of information about the firm, be it direct or be it indirect, the board will be less at a relative informational disadvantage compared to the CEO, and that's going to matter. So that's that's in the board's incentive to endogenously acquire all this information. Now, at this point, the natural question that would arise is it the board's decision or is it the CEO's decision? To that end, we propose an extension and look at the sort of like empirical predictions of that side of the model later. So we would come to that a little bit later. And through this model, we derive a number of testable predictions from the model. Based on that model, what we do is, we test those predictions using the data in US firms between 1999 and 2013 and obtain results that are largely consistent with our theory. Now, with any sort of corporate finance paper, endogeneity is a huge issue. So we try to shake the results using various sets of IV approach, etc., to look at the, really distinguish the causal side of the relationship. So what do we find? Really, the key thing that I would like to emphasize is that the CSR activities have different implications regarding board independence and monitoring, depending on what sort of information environment the firm is working in to begin with. Okay, so to see this, think about the sort of like following scenario. So the board will have an incentive to engage in CSR to reduce the informational asymmetry and engage in better advising, better monitoring. But we have to always think about in the absence of CSR. So what would have been their alternative in the absence of the CSR? So that's going to differ from opaque environment and the transparent environment. Now, in the opaque environment, CEO's private information is really valuable. So this is the sort of environment where the shareholders have really no option but to rely on that private information. CEO doesn't like, because he has a sort of private benefit from control of the project and hates monitoring, CEO is going to basically demand that unless you reduce independence to this so-and-so level, I will refuse to share the sort of information. That's the classic Adams and Ferreira setup. CSR can alleviate this problem in that sort of environment, opaque environment. So that would not only improve monitoring, but at the same time, the shareholders are no longer as much dependent on the CEO as before. So they will also be able to improve the governance side of it. They can make the level of independence, ex ante level of independence, higher. Now talk about the transparent information environment. So here, having more information, again, is useful, but let's also think about what would have happened in the absence of CSR. That's the sort of like area where the board basically would have been, yeah, but we don't really need your private information. We're just going to proceed without it. And we're just going to value independence and monitoring more than advising side of it. So there, already the governance is high. If that's the case, CSR will bring in new information. CSR will enable greater monitoring, but the effect on the governance side of it will be weaker because the shareholder was less dependent on the CEO for private information to begin with. So they would have been less likely to sacrifice governance even in the absence of CSR. So that leads to the key testable prediction of this paper, namely stronger strategic complementarity between board independence and CSR, where in opaque environment. And also that has an implication of monitoring, that in opaque environment, monitoring would increase hand in hand with governance and CSR together, while in transparent environment, the direct effect of CSR on the monitoring would likely be greater. And that's the prediction that we are testing through our empirical analysis. So given the sort of like time constraints, I don't want to dig too much into the sort of model side of it. So I'm just going to outline a basic setup and basically explain everything graphically. So it's a standard setup. For those of you who are familiar with Adams and Ferreira, you're very much likely to be familiar with this sort of setup. So in the initial date, the shareholder appoints the CEO and the board and determines how much independence we would like to go for. Then date one, some private information arrives to the CEO. He can decide whether to share it with the board or not. In some situations, it will be in the CEO's interest to share. In some situations, it might not. So in that case, if the CEO refuses, the board will then try the second opinion, i.e. commit to the CSR. And try for the stakeholder-induced information revelation. Now, as a modeling choice, we're saying it's a direct payment to the shareholders, but it needs not be viewed that way. Any form of payment that can improve the information environment, be it direct, be it indirect, would likely to have the same effect. It's identical as far as the model is concerned. Then the board uses that sort of information to engage in its own signal gathering activities. And obviously here the tension arises because signal gathering is more informative if it has access to that CS private info. And then, depending on the monitoring intensity, in the last stage, we assign the project control and project action is undertaken. So this is a key standard setup. Preference-wise, obviously we would like the CS preference to be biased relative to the shareholders, otherwise the problem's not interesting. CEO has private benefit from retaining control. Monitoring is less cumbersome to the board, assuming it has higher levels of independence. So if the shareholders go for monitoring side of it, they will want maximal independence. So that can be a little confusing. So let's talk about this in terms of a little graphics that I made. So what's happening within this model is basically that board's advice benefits everyone. Informed advising is good for everyone. So in that respect, the CEO will want to share information with the board. So that's good. But as I said before, sharing information also means more monitoring. So CEO may in terms, he may send out information regarding, looking for advice, but at the same time, he might be giving away information that can tie his hand later on. So because that means that, that means more intense monitoring and more independence, CEO dislikes that because of that private agency problem. So that's the source in which you have to weigh. As a CEO, you have to weigh between, do I value the advising side or do I value the monitoring side? I like the advising side, but if the cost from monitoring in my, from my incentive side of it is too high, I may refuse to share the information. So shareholders have a choice. They can appease the CEO. They can sacrifice board independence to obtain more information. Generally, what we are showing is that that's a more likely scenario in opaque environments. Now, in transparent environments, CEO's private information doesn't, have that much value. Information is most likely to be out in the open, so they can then proceed without private info and retain independence. But in any case, CSR can be the additional source of information. So you can treat it like a cost of acquiring information, be it the cost of drawing in new institutional investors, or be it appeasing the stakeholders. It can be anything. Okay, but what matters is that it addresses CEO board information asymmetry. As long as that level of information asymmetry is lowered sufficiently, you would have you would have the right incentive to engage in informationally motivated CSR. Now, at this point, I would like to emphasize that we're not interested in information side just only. Okay, I mean, we're not saying that that's the only means by which, the only motivation by which a firm would commit to CSR. What we're saying is that it's a plausible complementary channel by which the firm may consider CSR activities. So yes, this is basically the sort of like the model's prediction in the big picture. So in the first best scenario, no need for CSR. You're already at the no agency world. But without CSR, there are two possible choices I said earlier: induced revelation, appease the CEO, or move without CEO. In any case, the CSR can happen in opaque environment. Think about this sort of like middle induced revelation part, or the no revelation part. CSR can happen in both instances. But notice that the increase in governance only stems when there was sacrifice of independence to begin with. And where's that going to happen? In opaque environments. So in other words, in transparent environments, governance would already be normally high because the board and CEO's tension about information asymmetry isn't too great. The CSR can have an informational value, but its effect, its ex ante effect on governance is not likely to be that great. It's the opaque environment where the shareholders had to sacrifice their independence, where the complementary effect of governance and CSR would be markedly greater. So that's our key testable implication more than anything. Board independence and CSR are stronger complements in opaque information environments. And as a corollary, we find that in transparent firms, it's the direct effect of CSR that would aid the firm to be, the board to be better monitorers. In opaque firms, it's not just the CSR, it's the CSR moving together with greater independence that's going to be driving this increase in monitoring. So we get a nice prediction along the lines of what's going to happen in opaque environments and what's going to happen in transparent environments. Okay, so that's the theory side of it. Now for the data, it's very standard data. You know, it's CompuStat, CRISP, BoardX, and KLD data. Couple of other usual CSR sort of variables. We do stuff like the state level democratic leaning of each headquarter state. That's DiGiulio and Kostevsky is finding that red states are less likely to be engaged in CSR than blue state headquartered firms, etc., etc. Board independence, standard definition. Adjusted CSR score. Now that's for those of you who are not familiar in the CSR literature, KLD changes the sort of like number of strengths and weaknesses from year to year. So unless you have a normalized measure, the scores are not comparable from year to year. And then for the measures of an information cost, we use analyst-based measure as well as segment-based measure. That's the suggestion from Dutchen and Mastaka and Odros's 2010 JFE paper. So we use sub-adjusted analyst forecast error, dispersion, and from the segment level, that's also going to be relevant. Multiple segment firm, or how concentrated your business segments are. Look at it from a board's perspective. If you're the outside director of a firm, think about what's going to be hampering you from knowing what's going on in the firm. It's going to be sort of like, many segments doing different things and you finding it difficult to keep track of. You may be expert in one segment, but not other segments. Think about it that way, okay? So industry breakdown wise, I think that's a great point that Aminus raised earlier regarding how CSR is likely to be also related a lot to information environment, in that it's the consumer non-durables and business equipment. So it's the firms like Lego, Walt Disney, and Google and Facebook. It's these firms that engage more in CSR. Now we're going to talk about how that affects our empirical interpretation in just a minute. And naturally, the one with the worst CSR score, unsurprisingly, is the miners, the shale gases, and everyone. Yeah. Okay. So Jong-Sup and I talked about this early on, and it's this table that really drove us to write this paper. Univariate correlation. There's a very clear-cut correlation between high information cost environment and low information cost environment, and independence in CSR's correlation is markedly higher in high information environment compared to the low cost information environment. Sorry, low information cost environment. So, if you look at, for example, analyst forecast and dispersion as the subsample divider, high information cost, correlation of 0.15 compared to practically nothing for the low cost environment, low info cost environment, okay? So as an empirical test, we set up the sort of like following OLS model, simple model of CSR on independence and its interaction with the info cost measure. What we like to see is that the complementarity between independence and CSR would be stronger in opaque, i.e. high info cost environment. So, the standard set of controls, and what we find is, yes, we do that. Segment concentration, HHI, is the only thing where high number indicates low information cost. So you have to have the reversed sign for that, and that's exactly what you have. Strong sort of correlation. Now we can't establish, obviously, causality here yet, but it's a strong prima facie evidence that there is something going on between CSR and governance as a complement on the basis of information environment. So now we turn to the monitoring side of it. So the compensation, turnover logics, and as I said, independence and CSR going together will be stronger in opaque environments, and CSR alone, its standalone effect will be stronger in more transparent environments. Do we observe that? Yes, we do. So the difference in coefficients, looking at that, it's all bearing the expected sign with strong significance in most instances. So be it compensation end or be it turnover end. Now, you can't really do the subsample differences for logics, but it's bearing the right sign. So that's an indication that governance and CSR going together matter more for monitoring in opaque environments. It's just CSR has an impact on monitoring standalone in more transparent environments. But all these things are, endogenous, as all of us doing corporate finance know. So our key result could still be subject to a lot of heterogeneity. The first thing that we check is firm fixed effect. All qualitative results remain unchanged to the inclusion of firm fixed effects, so that's a plus. But here's another important thing, that it's still possible that other omitted variables drive both the level of independence as well as CSR activities. And here I would like to address Amina's comment on Slack too, because yes, in many instances, something else could be driving the information environment and CSR together. So like Google or like, I don't know, places like Facebook, for example, yes, those ones operating in sort of like consumer non-durables end of it, like high-tech firms tend to have employees that are really concerned about these sort of things, that they'll be engaging a lot more on the CSR side of it. True, but I think one strength of our paper is that the key foremost variable that we're interested in is the interaction between governance and info cost environment. So yes, information and cost can have some sort of like emitted sort of like higher level underlying driving relationship between them, but it's the interaction between governance and info cost that we're interested in. So here we shake the governance and try to get the exogenous variation in governance from there, and then try and test whether that interaction, it's not clear how governance and information environment would be sort of like affected according to that side of the story, right? So we have to find a good instrumental variable for the governance. So we do two things. We look at the Knitzeva sisters, the local director pool variable with Ron Masulis. We check that. Local director pool defined as the number of CompuStat firms located within 60-mile radius of a firm's headquarters. But, there have been issues with that, IV. So we also check Fracassi and Tate's director desk and mandatory requirements as another instrument. The results survive both IVs, and it's actually quite strong. In certain instances, actually, you get even higher T's as opposed to, the sort of like lower. One thing that we would like to emphasize here on endogenous board composition end of it is that from the first stage IV, we use the instrument's interaction with the info cost measure as an instrument for the board independence. It's not a sort of like a forbidden regression. It's there are two endogenous variables, so we do two instruments, and then we do that. But obviously, the results remain strong. So now to the EJU's introducing the facilitating question number 1 regarding who has the control of the CSR agenda. And that's actually a question that we get asked a lot in presentation. So what if the board doesn't have control and CEO wishes to sabotage CEO-driven transparency? Think about someone like Elon Musk. He's a great pioneer, but like eccentric as a CEO, for example. So that sort of person would not want this sort of like CSR-driven transparency that can sort of like have an impact on his private benefit of control. So what we do is to extend our theory in Appendix C of our paper, where we can probabilistically assign the board and the CEO to have the control of the CSR agenda. What we find is that yes, the informational value of CSR is weakened when the CEO has the control of the agenda, true. But as long as the board can have some say on the CSL agenda, its existence needs not be compromised. So it can be existing, it can still be a relevant channel, but it will have a weaker effect. So then the question becomes really an empirical question. So does that what we, is it really what we find? So what we find, what we do is to, slice it along CEO pay slice it along board's independence, other sort of like typical governance measures, E index, etc. What we find is that yes, the sort of like places where the CEO is likely to have more power and more control of the agenda, the high pay slice firm, low independence firm, duality firms, and places like that. Yes, the effect and the economic magnitude of our info channel does weaken, and the complementarity between governance and CSR does weaken, but it's still there. So it's weaker but still present, which sort of like suggests that yes, it's really along the expected line that we find in that the effect is still there, but with weaker economic magnitude, which is exactly what our theory predicts. So that allows me to conclude the paper. So we propose a new rationale for CSR, the information motive, and that what we are saying here is that CSR really would mitigate the CEO board information asymmetry, and by doing so, facilitate the board's functional efficiency in its dual role as advisor and monitor. So that strategic complementarity between independence and CSR in a opaque environment is borne out both by the theory as well as in the empirics. And our causal test, various IV approach, suggests that yes, the causal relationship does appear to be there. So we're not saying that we're trying to rise above and we're trying to find the only rationale for CSR in this governance versus agency debate. But what we are saying is we may be missing one additional complementary important channel and important benefit that a CSR could bring. And with that, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you.